The question exploded down the hallway of the Beacon Hill brownstone, its force rattling the quiet dignity of the old house like a physical blow. "Are you teaching my sons to pray? What in God's name is this? A chapel?" For a suspended moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath inside the softly lit bedroom. Leo and Noah, 5 years old and identical down to the cowlicks at their temples, sat frozen on the plush Persian rug, their small hands still laced together in a posture of supplication. Across from them, kneeling in her simple, worn house shoes, was Clara Finch. Her lips had just formed the final whispered words of a bedtime plea, a gentle message sent toward the heavens for the mother the boys barely remembered. Before Clara could utter a sound in her own defense, Julian Croft filled the doorway, his presence a storm front of tailored charcoal wool and simmering rage. His 6'2" frame seemed to suck the very air from the room, and his dark eyes, usually shuttered and distant, now flashed with a dangerous fire. In one hand, he clutched a sheaf of mail he'd been sorting through in his study. Without a flicker of consideration, he hurled the stack of unopened envelopes and a nearby leather-bound book toward the floor at her feet. The heavy volume skidded across the polished hardwood and struck Clara's shin, making her flinch and scramble backward with a small, involuntary cry. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked, his voice a low growl that vibrated with fury. "Are you running some kind of holy crusade in my home? This is my house, and I will not tolerate religious brainwashing under my roof." Clara's breath hitched, her back finding the cool, unyielding surface of the wall behind her. She raised her palms in a nervous, protective gesture, a silent plea for reason. "Mr. Croft, please, I didn't mean any harm. They were just talking about their mother, about how much they miss her. I thought if they could speak their feelings, upward, they might feel a little less alone." "I don't want to hear it," Julian snapped, stabbing a finger through the air for emphasis. His face was a mask of cold, controlled anger. "You will not fill my sons' heads with this nonsense about heaven or spirits or any of that imaginary garbage. We don't do that here. I am not raising my children on fairy tales and false hope." Leo, always the braver of the two, scrambled to his feet, his small voice trembling but determined. "Daddy, she just said we could talk to Mom." Noah, his echo, added, Not like church stuff. Just, if we say how we feel, maybe Mom will hear it. That's all." Clara's heart fractured as she looked at the boys, seeing the fear that had replaced their evening calm. "I wasn't preaching anything," she said quickly, her own voice now trembling under the weight of his condemnation. "I just wanted to give them a way to feel less alone. That was all. I am so sorry, Mr. Croft. I never intended to disrespect your beliefs." But Julian was a fortress, impenetrable and unforgiving. "You did disrespect them," he said, his voice dropping to the temperature of stone. "You knew the rules of this household. No religion. You broke them. I'm done. Pack your things. You're gone, first thing in the morning." Leo's eyes welled with tears, his lower lip quivering. "No, Daddy. Please don't send her away. She helps us sleep. She helps us feel better. She tells us stories about Mom," Noah whispered, his voice barely audible. "Enough!" Julian bellowed, his face darkening with an impatience that bordered on cruelty. "Back to your room. Now!" The boys hesitated, their small bodies caught between the two opposing forces in the room. Leo's hand instinctively clung to the fabric of Clara's skirt, and she gently prized his fingers away. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "Go on." "Go!" Julian shouted, the single word a gunshot in the quiet room. Startled into action, the boys fled, silent tears streaming down their flushed cheeks as they disappeared down the long, shadowed hallway. Clara was left alone, standing in a room that suddenly felt cavernous and suffocatingly silent. She swallowed against the hard lump forming in her throat. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice low and pleading, stripped of all its earlier defensiveness. "Please, don't fire me. I didn't mean to overstep. I wasn't thinking." "You didn't think. That's right," Julian said, turning his back on her as if her presence was a physical offense. "And now you're done. That's the end of it." "No, I promise I won't do it again," Clara said quickly, taking a small, desperate step forward. "I will follow every rule. I won't even speak about anything you don't want. I care about those boys." Julian didn't look back. His voice was a final damning verdict. "You'll be gone by morning." And with that, he strode out, leaving her standing in the wreckage of his anger. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the sharp sting of humiliation, and a deep, trembling weakness that started in her knees and radiated through her entire body. Alone in the quiet of the boys' bedroom, she slowly sat down on the edge of Leo's bed, her hands shaking in her lap. The faint scent of lavender and clean laundry, a scent she herself had created, now seemed to mock her. She had tried to bring comfort to this house of grief, and in return, she had been cast out. The next morning, Clara was gone before the Boston sunrise had a chance to pierce the gray city haze. She moved with a quiet efficiency, packing her few belongings into a worn suitcase, her movements practiced and silent. She didn't say goodbye. Julian hadn't given her permission, and the thought of facing the boys, of seeing the confusion and hurt in their eyes, was more than she could bear. But before she closed the heavy oak door behind her for the last time, she left a small, unassuming shoebox on the polished granite of the kitchen counter. Inside, nestled on a bed of tissue paper, were 2 crayon drawings the boys had made for her the week before. The first depicted a woman with bright, kind eyes standing under a sky filled with oversized golden stars. On either side of her stood 2 small boys, Leo and Noah, holding her hands and looking upward. Floating in the clouds above them was a smiling woman with long, flowing hair, their mother, Isabel. The second drawing was more intimate, a bedtime scene. A stick figure, clearly Clara, sat on the edge of a bed, reading to the twins, who were drawn with wide, happy smiles. A perfect crescent moon hung in the corner of the page. Beneath the pictures was a short note, written in Clara's careful, elegant cursive. "Mr. Croft, I understand your anger. I am truly sorry that I broke your trust. I was not attempting to teach your sons a religion. I only offered them a small way to cope with missing someone they love so dearly. At their age, grief is a burden far too heavy to carry alone. I only wanted to give them something soft to hold on to." Clara. Julian found the box just after he'd managed to get the boys through a tense, silent breakfast. He read the note once, his jaw tight, then shoved the lid back on with a sharp, definitive snap. He refused to feel anything. Not remorse, not doubt, not a flicker of empathy. He was a man of reason, of logic, of cold, hard reality. Emotions were a liability, a weakness he had long ago excised from his life, and he would not allow this woman to reintroduce them into his home. But in the days that followed Clara's abrupt departure, the atmosphere in the brownstone began to shift, quietly at first, then painfully. Leo and Noah no longer bounced into the kitchen with sleepy grins and demands for pancakes. They stopped asking for story time. They stopped asking for anything at all. A heavy blanket of silence seemed to have fallen over them, smothering their already fragile joy. They became withdrawn, their small faces pale and serious. They wouldn't look Julian in the eye. When he spoke to them, they offered only curt nods, their obedience swift but utterly devoid of warmth. At first, Julian refused to acknowledge the change. He blamed Clara, muttering to himself one night as he swirled a glass of expensive bourbon in his study. She made them soft, filled their heads with fantasies, and turned them against me. But late at night, when the boys were finally asleep, and the grand house echoed with a profound, unnerving silence, he knew the truth. It wasn't Clara they were reacting to. They were afraid of him. 3 days after she left, a lifetime in the silent world of his sons, Julian canceled 3 board meetings and a flight to Zurich. He instructed his assistant, Victoria, to clear his calendar for the rest of the week. No calls, no emails, no market analyses. Just him and his boys. He had no idea what he was doing. He had never had to try to connect with his children before. That had always been Isabel's domain. She was the warmth, the song, the softness in their lives. He was the structure, the safety, the provider. But now, with Isabel gone and Clara banished, he was forced to confront a terrifying reality. His sons had no softness left, and the absence of it was slowly extinguishing their spirits. So he began to watch. He didn't push, didn't force himself into their quiet, private world. He simply sat in the background of their lives, a silent, awkward observer. He offered to make breakfast and burned the pancakes so badly that the smoke alarm shrieked through the house. But they laughed, a small, hesitant sound that felt like a miracle. He read from their favorite dinosaur book, stumbling over the complicated names, his voice a monotone compared to Clara's animated storytelling. But they listened. He sat with them during their morning cartoons, laughing at jokes he didn't understand, the forced sound of it foreign in his own ears. Slowly, painstakingly, he listened. And slowly, something began to shift. Leo smiled first, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. Then Noah, in a moment of startling trust, asked to sit on his lap while they watched the rain streak down the long parlor windows. One evening, Julian found the boys whispering together near the window in their bedroom, their heads bowed close. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Noah turned, his expression open and innocent. "Just Mom." Julian froze, the familiar wall of logic and reason rising within him. You think she can hear you?" Leo shrugged, his small shoulders barely moving. "Miss Clara said maybe not with ears, but with love." The name hung in the air between them, a ghost of comfort they all missed. Julian sat down on the floor beside them, his long legs folded awkwardly. "Do you believe that?" Noah nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, and when we talk to her, it doesn't hurt so much inside." The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of Boston traffic. Julian didn't argue. He didn't lecture them about reality or the finality of death. Because deep down, in a place he never acknowledged, he still ached for Isabel, with a pain so profound that no amount of logic had ever managed to heal it. He finally whispered, echoing his son's words, "It doesn't hurt so much." Leo offered him a soft, understanding smile. "No, it feels like she's close." Julian looked at his boys, truly looked at them, and saw something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. It wasn't delusion or fantasy. It was peace. A quiet, steady peace that hadn't come from expensive toys or scheduled activities or sessions with the child therapist he'd hired. It had come from a woman he had fired in a fit of rage, A woman who had given his sons the one thing he had been too afraid, too broken, to give them himself. Hope. Soft, quiet, sacred hope. That night, as he sat on the edge of their beds, something unexpected happened. "Dad," Noah said, climbing onto his lap and wrapping his arms around his neck, "can you pray with us tonight?" Julian blinked, taken aback. "Me?" Leo nodded from his own bed. "Just like we used to with Miss Clara." He hesitated, a war raging within him. It went against every principle he held. It was illogical, irrational. But then he looked at their expectant faces, their eyes shining with a trust he was terrified of breaking again. Without another word, he slowly lowered himself onto the rug between their beds. The boys reached out, each placing a small hand in one of his. He took their hands, his large fingers engulfing theirs, and they bowed their heads. Noah whispered first, then Leo. Their words were simple, honest, and heartbreaking. "Miss you. Love you. Thank you." Then there was silence. It was his turn. Julian swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know who to say it to. But something inside him, a wall he had spent years building, finally cracked open. He finally whispered, the words barely audible in the still room, "I miss her too. Every single day." There was no lightning strike, no divine revelation. There was just a quiet stillness, and a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying began, ever so slightly, to lift. When he tucked them into bed a few minutes later, Leo grabbed his hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Daddy?" "Yes, Bud." "Can you ask Miss Clara to come back?" Julian paused, his heart lurching. "Please," Noah added, his voice a soft plea from his pillow. "We'll be good, we promise." Julian sat there in the dim light for a long time, looking from the ceiling down to the peaceful faces of his sleeping sons. He thought of the empty, echoing silence of the past week, of the burned pancakes and the hesitant smiles. He thought of the shoebox in his study and the simple, profound peace he had witnessed. "I think," he said slowly, his voice raspy with emotion, "I owe her an apology." For the first time in a long time, the boys fell asleep smiling, and Julian stayed with them a while longer, whispering one last sentence into the stillness of the room, a confession to himself as much as to anyone. "I've been too hard, too strict, but I see it now. I see what they need. What I need." Tomorrow, he would make a call. And maybe, just maybe, she would answer. The phone rang twice, each chime echoing the frantic pounding in his chest, before a soft, hesitant voice answered on the other end. "Hello? This is Clara." Julian Croft sat in his cavernous home office, the early morning light of Boston seeping through the tall, arched windows behind him. He was still in his silk robe, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold on the polished mahogany desk beside him. His hand tightened around the receiver, the plastic cool against his palm. "Clara, it's Julian Croft." There was a pause, brief but heavy with the unspoken history of their last conversation. "I didn't think I would be hearing from you again," she said carefully. Her tone was devoid of anger, but thick with caution. Julian cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I wasn't sure I would be calling you again either. But here I am." Silence stretched between them again. He stood and began to pace the length of the expensive rug, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "A real one. I didn't just overreact that night. I lost control. I humiliated you. I scared you. And I dismissed something you gave my sons that I didn't understand at the time. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. They've been on my mind. Are they all right? They miss you, he admitted, the confession costing him a piece of his stubborn pride. They've been talking about you a lot these last few days, more than I expected. He stopped pacing, his voice dropping. I miss you. No, that's not right. The boys miss you. They've been lost without you. I've been trying, God, I've really been trying, to fill the space you left behind, but I can't. Not the way you did. And now they're asking me to bring you back. Clara took a slow breath on the other end of the line. He could almost hear her weighing his words, searching for sincerity. I don't want to walk back into a place where I'm not welcome, Mr. Croft. You would be welcome this time, he said firmly, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. On your terms, no restrictions, no conditions about what you can or can't say to my children. I'm not that man anymore. Or at least, I'm trying not to be. A moment passed, then another. The silence was agonizing. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice still soft, but with a new layer of consideration. I'll think about it. I'll cover your transportation, of course. Anything you need, Julian said quickly, a wave of desperation washing over him. Just, please, consider it. She didn't make any promises. She didn't hang up in anger either. They said their goodbyes quietly, and Julian placed the phone back in its cradle, his heart pounding harder than it had in any boardroom negotiation. He had just ceded control, something he never did, and now all he could do was wait. 3 days later, Clara Finch stood on the front porch of the Croft estate, her worn suitcase in hand. The grand facade of the brownstone seemed even more imposing than she remembered. She hesitated before ringing the bell, half expecting the butler or one of the other household staff to answer. But the door swung open almost instantly, and there he was, Julian. Not in a crisp blazer, not radiating that intimidating aura of power, but just a man in a plain button-down shirt and slacks, his eyes tired but softer than she had ever seen them. Clara, he said, his voice low and full of a relief he didn't try to hide. Thank you for coming. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the familiar, opulent foyer. The air felt different, quieter, but not heavy with the oppressive pressure she remembered. From the top of the grand staircase came a loud, collective gasp. Miss Clara! Leo and Noah came rushing down the stairs, their bare feet slapping against the wood, their small arms wrapping tightly around her legs before she could even set down her bag. She laughed, a genuine musical sound that neither boy had heard in what felt like an eternity. You two are growing already, Clara said, crouching to hug them both properly, burying her face in their messy hair. Julian watched from the side, his arms folded across his chest, a complex mixture of guilt and gratitude etched onto his face. When the boys finally released her and disappeared into the kitchen to grab cookies for her, he stepped forward. I've gone over that night again and again in my head, he began, his voice earnest. And I realized something. It wasn't just your prayer that I hated. It was the peace I saw in their eyes when they said it. I didn't understand it. And I was jealous of it. Clara blinked, surprised by his raw honesty. I've lived my entire life by facts, Clara. Results, numbers, believing only what I can see and prove. But nothing I've done, not my money, my company, my careful, structured parenting, could give those boys what you gave them in a simple 2-minute prayer. She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. It wasn't the prayer itself, Mr. Croft. It was the permission. Permission to grieve, to feel, to believe that their mother's love didn't just vanish when she did. Julian lowered his head, the gesture one of complete surrender. "Can you forgive me?" Clara studied him for a long moment, seeing past the billionaire and the grieving widower to the father who was just trying to find his way. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes, but it's not just my forgiveness you need." Later that evening, after a dinner that was surprisingly relaxed, Clara found herself sitting on the floor of the twins' bedroom once again. The rug still had the same soft, intricate pattern. The toys were slightly more scattered, but everything felt familiar, like returning to a place she hadn't realized she'd missed so much. Julian stood awkwardly in the doorway, a hesitant guest in his own children's lives. Leo looked up from the book they were reading. "Daddy, are you going to sit with us again?" Julian stepped forward and, with a hint of his earlier awkwardness, sank to the rug beside them. "If that's okay." Noah grinned. "It's more than okay." Clara glanced at him, searching his face for any sign of his old rigidity. Finding none, she asked gently, "Would you like to lead it tonight?" Julian hesitated, a flicker of the old uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm not sure I know how." "There's no right way," Clara said softly. "Just honesty." The boys held his hands on either side, their small fingers a warm anchor. He took a deep breath, unsure if the words he was about to say would make sense to anyone but himself. "Hi," he said aloud, his gaze directed toward the ornate ceiling. "It's me. I don't really know how this works, but if you're listening, Isabel, I want you to know the boys are okay. They're stronger than I ever imagined." He glanced at them, a flicker of a smile touching his lips, then looked back up. "And I'm trying to be, too." He paused, the next words catching in his throat. "Also, I'm sorry for not letting them speak to you, for making grief something they had to hide." Tears filled Clara's eyes as she watched. Ben smiled softly and whispered, "Hi, Mommy." Noah nodded, adding, "We love you." Then silence fell over the room. Not an empty, awkward silence, but one filled with breath, with warmth, and with something unexplainable and profound. When the boys were tucked into bed, Alexander stood in the hallway with Maya. "You were right," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't trying to be right," Maya replied softly. He managed a faint smile. "I was too harsh, too disciplined. I thought control was the answer to everything. It turns out, softness matters just as much." Maya looked at him carefully, the question in her eyes clear. "So, what now?" "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Not just as a nanny, as someone they trust, and someone I trust." Her eyes glistened in the dim light of the hallway. "On my terms?" He nodded, his expression serious. "Absolutely." She tilted her head, a small playful smile gracing her lips. "That's going to include bedtime prayers." He chuckled, a real, unburdened sound. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Just as Clara turned to leave for her room for the night, the boys peeked out from their doorway. "Daddy?" Leo asked. "Yeah, bud." "Thank you for asking Miss Clara to come back," Noah added, a sleepy grin on his face. "Best prayer ever." Julian smiled, and this time it was a smile that truly reached his eyes, erasing the shadows that had lived there for so long. "Best decision I've made in a long, long time." The morning after Clara's return, the entire house felt different. It wasn't just the boys who noticed the change. Julian himself felt it, a quiet hum of peace that had settled in the air overnight. For the first time in weeks, the twins woke up on their own, wandered into the kitchen, and greeted their father not with guarded silence, but with soft smiles and adorably messy hair. He was already there, awkwardly flipping pancakes at the professional-grade stove, wearing an apron that looked comically out of place over his tailored trousers. "Morning, boys," he said, his concentration fixed on the skillet. Noah peeked over the marble countertop. "Are those chocolate chips?" "I may have gone a little overboard," Julian admitted with a sheepish grin. Leo tilted his head. "You burned the last ones," Julian chuckled, a low, easy sound. "Don't remind me." Clara entered moments later, her presence like a gentle breeze brushing through the room, steady, calming, and grounding. She wore simple jeans and a soft blue blouse, her light brown hair tied back, her eyes alert and warm. "You're cooking?" she asked Julian, raising a single perfect eyebrow. "I'm attempting to," he corrected, gesturing with the spatula. "Smells like enthusiasm," she teased, moving to pour juice for the boys. They all sat at the breakfast table together, a rare and precious moment. Even before Isabel's death, Julian had almost always eaten separately, his mornings consumed by conference calls with London or market reports from Tokyo. But now he was here, fully present, watching his sons tell silly stories between bites of slightly misshapen, chocolate-filled pancakes. Theo leaned across the table mid-laugh, his face alight with mischief. "Daddy, guess what? Leo told a joke at breakfast." "Oh, really?" Julian smiled, playing along. "Let's hear it." Leo grinned, puffing out his small chest. "Why did the pancake go to therapy?" "Why?" Julian asked, feigning deep curiosity. "Because it felt flat." Clara laughed first, a bright, clear sound that filled the kitchen. Then Noah, then Julian, shaking his head in mock despair at the terrible punchline. For a few minutes, they were just a family, sharing a simple, joyful meal. After breakfast, the boys went out to the small, manicured backyard, their toy spaceship in hand, ready for an intergalactic adventure. Clara began clearing the dishes, but Julian remained seated, stirring the dregs of his coffee. "I don't know how long this will last," he said quietly, his gaze distant. Clara glanced at him, pausing with a plate in her hand. "What do you mean?" This peace, this calm. Part of me keeps waiting for it to fall apart again." Clara wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked over to the table, sitting down across from him. "Julian, peace isn't something that just falls into your lap and stays there. It's something you practice, something you choose every day. The boys are adjusting because they feel safe again. That's not an accident. That's you showing up." He hesitated, his voice dropping lower. I didn't realize how afraid they were of me." "You weren't cruel," she said gently, her eyes full of an empathy that soothed the raw edges of his guilt. "You were hurting. You were trying to control your pain by controlling everything and everyone else around you. I've seen it before. Parents who are so afraid to feel that they demand their children not feel either." Julian looked away, staring out the window at his sons. "You never taught them how to cry," she continued softly. "But they needed to, and you're lucky they found a way to do it without falling apart completely." He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening but not breaking. He was a man unlearning a lifetime of emotional suppression, and it was a slow, painful process. Later that afternoon, Julian watched from the upstairs library window as the twins played on the grass. They were building a pretend rocket launch site using garden stones and popsicle sticks they'd saved. Clara sat nearby on a bench with a book, occasionally looking up to remind them not to dig too deep into the pristine lawn. He wasn't just watching them. He was studying them. Their joy, their ease, the way they moved with a sense of belonging in the world again. It struck him with the force of a physical blow that he hadn't just been an absent father in terms of time. He had been emotionally unreachable, a distant, cold planet in their small universe. When Clara came inside a while later to prepare snacks, Julian met her in the hallway. "There's something I haven't told the boys yet," he said, his tone serious. Clara turned to face him, her expression patient. "I haven't been to Isabel's grave since the funeral. Not once." Her expression softened with understanding. "That's not unusual, Julian. Grief isn't linear. There's no right way to do it." "I know, but I think it's time. And I want to take the boys. I think it's something we need to do together." Clara nodded, her approval silent but clear. "Do you want me to come with you?" He paused, the question hanging in the air between them. "Would you?" "Of course." The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, Julian drove the three of them himself, the boys and Clara, to Mount Auburn Cemetery on the outskirts of Cambridge. The boys were unusually quiet in the back seat, each holding a small bouquet of wildflowers they had picked from the garden. When they arrived, the ornate iron gate creaked as it opened, a mournful, fitting sound. Julian parked under an old oak tree and stepped out slowly, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. They walked together down a narrow, winding path, Clara holding Noah's hand, Julian guiding Leo. When they reached the modest headstone of white marble, engraved with the simple, elegant words, "Isabel Grace Croft, beloved wife and mother," the boys stood still, their heads slightly bowed. Julian knelt first, his expensive trousers pressing into the damp earth. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come here," he whispered. The words meant only for her. Clara stood a respectful distance behind, giving them their space, a silent, supportive presence. Leo placed his small bouquet on the grass in front of the stone. "Hi, Mommy. We miss you," Noah added, his voice small but clear. "We talk to you every night now. I hope you hear us." Julian's hands trembled as he reached out and brushed a fallen leaf from the cold marble. "I've been trying to be strong," he confessed to the stone, to the air, to himself. "Too strong. For them. For myself. But I've learned something. Strength isn't pretending you don't feel. It's letting yourself feel and still managing to stand back up." His voice broke slightly. "I've made mistakes. I've pushed people away. People who were only trying to help." He glanced over his shoulder at Clara, and she met his gaze without flinching. "I want to do better," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "For them. For you. For me." The wind stirred, rustling the leaves in the trees above them. For a moment, it felt as though Isabel was there, listening, her presence a gentle whisper on the breeze. Leo looked up at his father. "Daddy?" "Yes." "Can we come here again sometime and talk to her?" Julian nodded, a genuine smile finally breaking through his sorrow. "As often as you want." They lingered a little longer, the four of them standing together in the quiet cemetery. Not much was said, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt whole, complete. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Julian sat on the back porch with Clara. The first stars were beginning to peek through the deep navy of the sky, and the distant sound of city life was a muted hum. "I think today was the first day I really let go," he said, staring up at the heavens. Clara nodded, her silhouette serene in the twilight. "You don't have to carry it all alone anymore." He looked at her then, his eyes earnest, and full of a gratitude he couldn't yet put into words. "You've given them something I never could. And you've given me something I didn't even know I needed." Clara smiled gently. "You gave it to yourself, Julian. I was just there to remind you how. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze returning to the sky. I don't know if I believe in prayer, he said thoughtfully, but I believe in healing. That's a start, Clara whispered, and for the first time since Isabel's passing, Julian Croft closed his eyes, not to block out the world, but to finally, fully, breathe it in. Saturday morning arrived with a golden sun pouring through the wide, elegant windows of the Croft estate. The smell of blueberry muffins drifted from the kitchen as Clara moved with an easy, practiced grace, her apron dusted with flour. She was humming an old gospel tune under her breath, a melody she hadn't sung in years, not since before she'd moved to Boston, not since losing her younger brother, Daniel, to a sudden illness. But something about this home, about these boys, had made the songs come back to her. Julian stepped into the kitchen just as she was setting a plate of warm muffins on the counter. He looked rested, softer. The usual armor of control, the crisp suits, the clipped, businesslike tone, had gradually worn thin, replaced by something more approachable, more human. "Did you just hum?" he asked, a half-smile playing on his lips. "I suppose I did," she answered, a little surprised herself. "I don't know that I've ever heard anyone hum in this house," he said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. "It's oddly comforting." Clara smiled. Then maybe the house needed it. Leo and Noah came barreling down the stairs moments later, their socked feet skidding on the polished hardwood floors. "Miss Clara, Daddy said we can go to the park today." Julian nodded. "Thought it might be good to get some fresh air. It's a beautiful day." "Can we bring the kites?" Noah asked, his eyes wide with hope. "Of course," Clara said, her heart swelling at the simple, unadulterated joy on their faces. The park was only a 15-minute drive away, nestled beside the Charles River, its weeping willows and wooden benches offering a picturesque escape from the city's bustle. It had been a favorite spot of Isabel's. She used to bring the twins here before they could even walk, resting them on a blanket under the trees while she sketched in her notebook. When they arrived, the wind was perfect, steady but playful. The boys raced ahead, kites in hand, the strings unraveling like streams of laughter behind them. Clara and Julian followed at a slower pace, the soft grass crunching beneath their feet. "I haven't been here since Isabel passed," Julian admitted, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape with a mixture of pain and nostalgia. "She used to draw here, didn't she?" Clara asked softly, remembering a story the boys had told her. He nodded, a distant look in his eyes. "She said the trees reminded her of her childhood somewhere down south. Said the willows looked like they were crying for the world." Clara stopped walking, considering the graceful, drooping branches. "They don't look sad to me. They look like they're holding stories. Old ones." Julian managed a faint smile. She would have liked that. They found a bench near the water where they could watch the boys run in dizzying, joyful circles, with their kites soaring high above. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the happy shrieks of childhood. Then Clara asked, her voice gentle, "Do they know much about her? About Isabel, I mean?" Julian exhaled slowly, a long, weary sound. "Bits and pieces. I've told them what I thought they could handle, but I've been too careful, too guarded. You think if you tell them the whole story, it'll hurt more," Clara said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Yes," he admitted, "and no. I think it'll hurt me more." Clara looked at him with a profound kindness that seemed to see right through him. "They don't just need the facts, Julian. They need her," the sound of her laugh, The way she used to dance in the kitchen when no one was watching. The stories that only you can give them. He nodded, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. You're right. Start small, she encouraged, her voice a soothing balm. A story at bedtime. One memory, one moment. That's all it takes. That night, after the boys had bathed and wriggled into their pajamas, they curled up on either side of Julian in the cozy reading nook in their bedroom. The room smelled of lavender and old books. Clara leaned against the doorframe, a silent, supportive observer. "Boys," Julian began, clearing his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "Do you remember that time we went to the beach with Mommy?" Leo's eyes lit up with recognition. "The time she buried Noah in the sand up to his neck?" Julian laughed, a real, unrestrained sound. "Exactly. And you thought he'd be stuck there forever." Noah giggled at the memory. "She told me crabs were going to nibble my ears." "She did," Julian nodded, smiling. "She was always teasing. But do you remember what she did right before we left that day?" The boys thought for a moment, their small faces scrunched in concentration. "She picked up a shell," Leo said finally, "and she whispered into it." Julian nodded, his heart aching with the sweetness of the memory. "She said every shell holds the last whisper of the sea, and that if we listened carefully, we could hear the ocean missing us when we left." Noah blinked, his eyes wide. "I remember that." "She said we belong to the waves," Leo added softly. Julian's voice grew quiet, thick with emotion. That was her, always finding poetry in the ordinary. Silence fell over the room, soft and thick like a blanket. And then something surprising happened. Julian's face trembled, his jaw tightened, and his eyes brimmed with tears. He looked down, trying to blink them away, but a single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. Leo reached up, his small hand gently touching his father's face. "Daddy, are you crying?" Clara took a step forward, ready to intervene, but stopped herself. This was their moment. "No," Noah whispered, his voice full of a child's simple wisdom. "He's not crying. He's remembering." And in that moment, Julian didn't correct them. He didn't try to explain it away or hide his vulnerability. He simply let it be, allowing his sons to see his grief, to share it, and in doing so, to lighten its load. Later, after the boys were asleep, Julian found Clara in the kitchen, making tea. "You were right," he said, his voice still a little hoarse. Clara smiled, not looking up from the steaming kettle. "About what, this time?" "About the stories, about how they need her, even if it hurts. And so do I." Clara poured 2 cups, handing one to him. The fragrant steam rose between them. "You're doing the work, Julian. That's what matters." He nodded, then hesitated, a new thought taking shape. "Clara, there's something I've been thinking about." She raised an eyebrow over the rim of her cup. "That sounds serious." "I want to make some changes," he said, his voice gaining a new resolve. "To this house, to this life. I don't want the boys growing up thinking love is something quiet and private, something to be hidden away. I want them to see it, to hear it, to feel it all around them." "And what does that look like to you?" she asked, her gaze steady. He looked down at his tea, then up at her, his eyes meeting hers with a new intensity. "It looks like dinners together, walks in the park, bedtime stories that don't end when the lights go out, and it looks like someone like you staying, not just as a nanny." Clara stilled, the teacup frozen halfway to her lips. "I'm not asking for anything more than your presence," he said quickly, afraid he had overstepped. Just stay. Keep being the voice they trust, the warmth they need. And maybe, if you can, keep humming those songs. Clara laughed softly, a sound that eased the tension in the room. You're not as complicated as you think you are, Julian Croft. Is that a yes? He asked, a hopeful vulnerability in his voice. She didn't answer directly, but she didn't say no either. And outside, beyond the quiet of the kitchen, the Boston night air was still, like the pause between heartbeats, full of something new, something healing, and something that felt an awful lot like home. The low morning fog hung over Beacon Hill, casting a silver hue over the manicured gardens and cobblestone alleys. Inside the Croft residence, the warmth of a newfound routine had taken hold. Clara prepared breakfast, while Leo and Noah sat at the massive kitchen island, their heads bent in concentration as they drew elaborate pictures of dinosaurs and pirate ships. Julian was in the adjoining living room, finishing a call with his COO in London, though he kept glancing toward the kitchen, a magnetic pull he no longer bothered to fight. Clara had started noticing a lot about him lately. The way he listened more carefully when the boys spoke, his brow furrowed in genuine interest. The way his footsteps on the hardwood floors were slower, softer, less hurried. And the way he smiled now, not just out of politeness, but from a place of authentic, unburdened feeling. "Are you drawing a Tyrannosaurus Rex with sunglasses?" she asked Leo, leaning over his shoulder with a grin. "He's not just a T-Rex," Leo said, with the gravity only a 5-year-old can muster. "He's a DJ T-Rex." "Oh," Clara said, pretending to be shocked. "Clearly, I'm behind on my dinosaur fashion," Noah chimed in, not looking up from his own masterpiece. "And he has headphones made of cookies." "Obviously," Clara nodded solemnly. Julian finally joined them, his phone tucked away, a mug of coffee in his hand. "DJ Cookie Rex sounds like someone we should invite to family night." The boys' eyes lit up in unison. "Family night?" "Yeah," Julian said, leaning against the counter. "We've never really had one. I thought maybe on Friday nights we could do something together. Games, movies, whatever you two monsters want." Clara glanced at him, pleasantly surprised. This was new. Voluntary, unstructured family bonding. Noah clapped his hands together. "Can we do s'mores and watch that movie where the dog flies a plane?" "And you have to let Miss Clara come too," Leo added, his tone making it a non-negotiable condition. Julian smiled, his gaze meeting Clara's over the boys' heads. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Leo and Noah cheered without hesitation. "Yay! Miss Clara's part of family night." Clara smiled, a warm, genuine expression, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a hesitation, a shadow of concern. Julian noticed it. Later that day, after the boys were down for their afternoon nap, he found her folding laundry in the den, the rhythmic snap of sheets filling the quiet room. "Something on your mind?" he asked gently, leaning against the doorframe. She paused, then folded a towel with slow, deliberate movements. "They're getting attached. Fast." "Is that a bad thing?" he asked, though he already knew her concern. "It's not bad," she said carefully, her eyes focused on her task. "But it's a line I've been afraid of crossing." He stepped closer, his presence filling the small room. "Because of Isabel?" Clara finally looked up, her expression unguarded. "Because I'm not their mother. I don't want them to confuse comfort with replacement. Children do that, especially when the grief is so fresh." He nodded, understanding. "I get that. But I think you're underestimating how smart they are. They know you're not their mother. They also know you're the one who's here. I'm not their replacement, Julian, but I'm not a stranger either. And if I stay too long, and then have to disappear again." Her voice trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging between them. "You're afraid of hurting them." "Yes," she said quietly, "and of hurting myself." There was a pause between them, a long, honest silence that acknowledged the complexity of their situation. "I won't ask you to be something you're not, Clara," Julian said, his voice low and sincere. "But you are something to them, whether you ask to be or not." Clara folded another shirt, her movements still precise, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. "I'm trying to build something real here," he continued, his voice earnest. "Not just recover from what I've lost, but grow from it. I can't do it alone. And they trust you in a way I may never fully understand." Clara looked at him then, the weight of her own past sorrows visible in her eyes. "And what about you, Julian? Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air, direct and unflinching. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, reached for the stack of unfolded laundry, and began to fold with her, their hands moving in a quiet, companionable rhythm, side by side. That Friday night, family night, made its official debut. The grand living room was transformed. Blankets and pillows were piled on the floor, creating a cozy nest. String lights were hung across the ornate fireplace mantel, and a vintage-style popcorn machine, borrowed from Victoria's eccentric cousin, buzzed cheerfully in the corner. Leo wore a superhero cape over his pajamas. Noah wore pajama pants and a fireman's hat. Clara wore fuzzy socks and carried a tray laden with s'mores supplies. Julian, much to everyone's surprise, wore a hoodie with a cartoon astronaut on it. "What is that?" Clara asked, pointing at his sweatshirt with a laugh. "I was told I needed to embrace comfy core," he said dryly. "Apparently, this is what that looks like." "You look like a dad trying to infiltrate a teenage sleepover," she teased. He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Close enough." They watched the movie, the ridiculous one with the dog flying the plane, and halfway through, Noah crawled into Clara's lap, his small body warm and trusting. Leo curled up next to his father, his head resting against Julian's arm. For a moment, bathed in the flickering light of the television, they looked like a family untouched by grief. A perfect tableau of domestic peace. But midway through the second movie, as the boys were starting to drift off, Noah whispered something into the collar of Clara's sweater. "Miss Clara, do you think Mommy can see us having fun?" Clara hugged him gently, her hand stroking his hair. "I think if she can, she's smiling right now." Leo looked up at his father, his eyes heavy with sleep, but his question clear. "Do you think she'd be okay if we're happy?" Julian's throat tightened. He looked at Clara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, then back at his sons. "I think she'd be relieved that you're happy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She would want that more than anything in the world." Noah nodded sleepily against Clara's shoulder. "Then I'm glad." After the boys were tucked into their beds, Clara stayed behind to clean up the remnants of their party. She stacked dishes in the kitchen, humming without even realizing it. Julian stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching her. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I always thought family was about structure, responsibility, expectations. But tonight felt different." "Tonight felt real," Clara replied, rinsing a sticky marshmallow fork under the tap. He watched her for a long moment, the quiet efficiency of her movements, the gentle peace she carried with her. Would it scare you if I said I've started to think of you as part of our family? She turned slowly, wiping her hands on a towel, her gaze searching his face. A little, she admitted honestly, because once people call you family, they expect you to stay. And what if I asked you to stay? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Then I'd have to ask how you mean it, she said, her tone calm but firm. As the nanny? As a friend? As something else? Julian stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I don't have all the answers. I just know this house didn't start to feel like a home again until you came back. Clara looked down at the granite countertop, then back up at him. I care about them, Julian, deeply. But I also have a life, dreams of my own. I've put some of them on hold just to get through these past few years. I don't want to take anything from you, he said quickly. She studied him, her head tilted slightly. But do you know what you're asking me to give? They stood in that tension, real, honest, adult tension. It wasn't built on romance, but on something far more foundational. Trust, shared grief, and a deep, unspoken connection that was forming just beneath the surface of their lives. I'm asking you, he said slowly, choosing his words with care, to consider staying. Not forever, not blindly, just a little longer, until we figure out what this is. Clara didn't reply right away, but she didn't say no. As she turned off the kitchen lights, leaving them standing in the soft glow from the hallway, she said, Let's just take it one Friday night at a time. Julian smiled. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. It had been 3 weeks since family night became an official tradition in the Croft household. What began as a one-time tentative attempt at reconnection had evolved into something sacred, an evening the boys counted down to with feverish excitement. The household staff adjusted their schedules for without complaint, and Julian himself protected on his calendar with an uncharacteristic, almost fierce resolve. Friday evenings were no longer just a break from the relentless demands of his work. They were a declaration. This family matters. But outside the warm, protective cocoon of their Beacon Hill home, the world had not paused. Julian's company, Croft Technologies, was in the final stages of a major acquisition, a deal that would reshape the industry. The board was growing restless, pressuring him to return to his full-time, round-the-clock operational role. His inbox overflowed with contracts that needed his signature, briefings that required his attention, and urgent invitations to galas and summits he had no intention of attending. But for the first time in his illustrious career, Julian didn't leap to respond. Instead, he was busy helping Noah pick out glow-in-the-dark stars for the ceiling of their bedroom and engaging in a serious debate with Leo about whether his imaginary friend, a swashbuckling pirate named Captain Pillowbeard, deserved his own seat at the dinner table. Still, not everyone was thrilled by this profound shift in his priorities. The descent arrived on a Saturday morning, heralded by a knock on the front door that was sharp, fast, and impatient. Clara opened it to find Victoria Hayes, Julian's longtime executive assistant, standing on the stoop dressed in a severe navy pantsuit and an expression that could crack glass. "Is Mr. Croft available?" Victoria asked, her tone clipped and devoid of pleasantries. "He's in the sunroom with the boys," Clara replied, her own tone cautious. Victoria stepped inside uninvited, her high heels echoing like gavel strikes across the marble floor. Julian appeared moments later, holding a half-empty juice box and looking every bit the part of a dad caught off guard. "Victoria," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here on a weekend?" "We need to talk," she said firmly, her gaze sweeping over his casual attire with faint disapproval. "Now?" He led her to the study, the heavy doors closing behind them with a soft click. Clara stayed back, but she could hear the low murmur of their voices as she moved quietly through the nearby kitchen. "The board is concerned, Julian," Victoria began, her voice sharp and to the point. "You've been skipping meetings, delegating major decisions, and dodging press inquiries for weeks. This acquisition is too important for you to disappear." "I haven't disappeared," Julian replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm reprioritizing." Victoria's perfectly sculpted brows lifted in disbelief. "By playing house?" His expression darkened. "Watch your tone, Victoria." "You're not yourself," she said, ignoring the warning, her frustration overriding her usual deference. "The Julian Croft I know never let emotion get in the way of business." He stood up, his height giving him an immediate advantage, but his posture was defensive, not aggressive. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe that version of me wasn't sustainable. Victoria narrowed her eyes, her gaze flicking for a moment toward the hallway where Clara was. "Is this about the nanny?" He froze, his jaw tightening. "This is about my sons, and the fact that for the first time since Isabel died, I'm actually showing up for them." "And what about Croft Technologies, the company you built from the ground up?" "I built that company to give them a future," he said, his voice rising with a passion she hadn't heard in years. "But what good is that future if I sacrifice their present to achieve it?" Victoria stared at him, stunned into silence. Finally, she said coldly, "You'll lose the board's confidence if this continues." "Then maybe they're not the right board," he shot back, the finality in his tone leaving no room for argument. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to bed and the house had settled into its quiet, nighttime rhythm, Julian found Clara on the back porch, sipping chamomile tea under a string of warm, glowing lights. "She was right, you know," he said, sinking into the chair beside her. "Victoria?" Clara asked, her voice neutral. "She's worried I'm throwing away everything I've built." Clara looked at him, her gaze steady in the dim light. "Are you?" He considered the question for a long moment, staring out at the darkened garden. "No, I'm just realizing I built it all without any balance. I worked so hard to create a future that I completely forgot to live in the now. I forgot that my boys need me, not just my success." Clara nodded. "There's no substitute for presence. I was always terrified of being a father who failed," he admitted, the confession raw and honest. "So I overcompensated with rules, with structure, with control. I thought grief was something you could outsmart, something you could manage like a hostile takeover. But it's not." She turned to him, her expression soft with understanding. "It's something you sit with, something you survive. And you're doing that." He looked at her then, truly seeing her not just as a caregiver for his children, but as a person with her own history, her own scars. "You've done that too, haven't you?" Clara's eyes softened, a distant sadness touching their depths. "My little brother, Daniel. Cancer took him when he was 9. I was 15. My parents, they couldn't even speak his name for years. But I talked to him every night. I still do, sometimes." Julian swallowed hard. "And that helped?" She nodded. "Because people don't fall apart when they're seen, Julian. They heal. The boys are healing. So are you." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry some of his tension with it. "And you?" Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe a little. Being here, it has stirred up things I buried a long time ago. But it's also reminded me that love doesn't die with the people we lose. It keeps showing up. In crayon drawings, in bedtime hugs, in burnt pancakes." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. I'm never going to live that down, am I? Not a chance, she said, her own smile widening. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the air between them warm and charged with unspoken feelings. Then Julian turned to her, his expression serious again. Clara, would you ever consider staying longer? Not just as a nanny, but— She held up a hand, gently stopping him. I know what you're asking, and I need time. Not because I'm unsure of what this means to me, but because I want to be sure it's what's best for the boys. And for us. I've seen too many families confuse healing with attachment. He nodded, respecting her honesty and her wisdom. Take all the time you need. She looked at him, her gaze steady and clear. But I'm not going anywhere for now. And that's something. It was more than something. It was hope. The next morning, Julian sat in the garden with the boys. The sun filtered through the branches of a Japanese maple, dappling the grass with light. Leo was braiding blades of grass into something that vaguely resembled a bracelet. Noah was having a very serious conversation with a ladybug perched on his finger. "Daddy?" Leo asked, not looking up from his task. "Yes, Bud." "Do you think Mommy sent Miss Clara to us?" Julian looked over at Clara, who was watching them from the porch with a gentle smile. He thought about it, about fate and coincidence, and the strange, beautiful, and often painful ways that life unfolds. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I do think Mommy would be very glad she's here." Noah looked up, his face serious. "Do you think Miss Clara will stay forever?" Julian looked over at Clara again, their eyes meeting across the stretch of green lawn. A silent conversation passed between them, one of shared hope and patient understanding. "I hope," he said quietly, his voice full of a feeling he was just beginning to understand, "that she stays as long as her heart tells her to." With that, the boys returned to their games, their laughter filling the garden with a light and a joy that was more precious than anything Julian had ever built. It was the fragile but powerful sound of belonging. It had been a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that arrived like a whispered promise after a long week. The boys were still asleep, their shared bedroom a peaceful fortress of stuffed animals and scattered Legos. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls, a scent that had become synonymous with Clara, wafted through the halls. Julian had offered to help, but after burning toast 2 days in a row, he had been gently but firmly reassigned to permanent dish duty. Clara stood barefoot in the kitchen, moving with an easy, fluid grace, a soft gospel tune humming from her lips. She didn't know Julian was watching her from the doorway, his coffee mug held loosely in his hand, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward slowly, his presence announced by the soft creak of a floorboard. "You always hum when you're at peace." She glanced back, a small, knowing smile on her face. "Not always. Sometimes I hum to find peace." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "Seems to be working now." They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, the only sound the gentle ticking of the oven timer as it counted down the final minutes on the cinnamon rolls. Julian finally spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something you said the other night. About people healing when they're seen." Clara turned to face him fully, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Yes?" He looked out the large kitchen window, where the garden shimmered with morning dew. "I've spent so many years hiding my own pain behind performance, behind success. I knew how to win. I didn't know how to feel." "You're feeling now," she said softly, "but I don't know what to do with it all." "You don't have to do anything," she said gently, her voice a soothing balm. "Just let it be real." Julian set his mug down on the counter, the ceramic clinking more firmly than he'd intended. But what if being real disappoints them? What if it disappoints you? Clara's voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. You're not a disappointment, Julian. You're a man learning how to be present. There's no handbook for rebuilding a broken heart. You just start by showing up, day after day. Before he could answer, the sound of small, thundering footsteps echoed down the hall. "Daddy! Miss Clara! Come quick!" Noah shouted breathlessly, his face flushed with excitement. Leo trailed behind him, holding something tightly in his small hands. "We found something in Mommy's room." Julian and Clara followed them upstairs, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension blooming within them. Isabel's room had remained largely untouched since her passing. Her journals were still stacked neatly on the bedside table, a silk scarf was still draped over the vanity chair, and her favorite perfume bottle collected dust like a quiet, fragile ghost. "Are you two supposed to be in here?" Julian asked gently, his voice softer than it would have been just a few months ago. "We were just looking for Mommy's necklace," Leo said, "the one with the blue stone." "It helps me feel close to her," Noah added. Clara gave Julian a look, a silent message that said, "Let them be." The boys rushed to the nightstand and held out a small, velvet-bound notebook. "We found her prayer journal," Noah whispered, his eyes wide with a kind of reverent awe. Julian froze. He reached out slowly, taking the notebook with a reverence that mirrored his son's. The cover was worn at the edges, soft, with years of use. He opened it, his breath catching in his throat as he saw her familiar handwriting. Slanted, beautiful, unmistakable. He flipped through pages filled with her prayers, her poems, and lists of things she was grateful for. March 15th. Leo said his first full sentence today. He asked, "Where Mommy go?" I told him I'm always close, even when he can't see me. I think he understood. April 7th. I'm scared. The doctors are running more tests, but I'm praying for strength for Julian. He doesn't pray, but I do. Enough for both of us. June 10th. The boys are getting so big. I worry they'll forget the sound of my laugh. I hope Julian reminds them how much I love to dance, even when no one was looking. Julian's hands trembled as he read the words. Clara placed her hand over his, a silent, steadying presence. "She wrote for you," she said quietly, "so you'd remember, so you'd feel." He nodded, unable to speak, a hard lump forming in his throat. Leo tugged at his sleeve. "Can we read it too?" Julian took a deep, shaky breath. "Yes, but together." They sat on the floor, the four of them huddled close, and read passages aloud. Clara's voice filled the space when Julian's became too thick with emotion. The boys listened with rapt attention, hearing their mother's words like a song from the past, a message sent just for them. "I think Mommy's prayers still work," Noah said softly when they had finished. "Because now we have Miss Clara." Julian glanced at Clara, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. She asked for strength, he thought, and somehow you showed up. Later that day, Clara sat alone in the garden, the journal still resting in her lap. Julian approached slowly, his hands in his pockets, a thoughtful expression on his face. "She wrote about you, too," he said, sitting beside her on the stone bench. Clara looked over, surprised. "She did?" He nodded. "In one of the last entries. She wrote about a woman she'd met briefly at a charity event, a woman with quiet fire in her eyes. She said you had the kind of presence that could change